okay?
Yes.
Right, so let's make a start. Now, I've chose 1,000 years, so this goes up to 1800. Because I'm not an expert on modern things, so the last 200 years are far too modern. So I'll finish in the year 1800. Down. Yeah. Whoops. You'll see that. What was? Do it that way. Right, so there's the church in the middle of the street. And it always was a straggly village along that main street there. But as you see, it's right in the centre of things, as the church should be. Now, people have lived in this valley of the Loddon for thousands and thousands of years. Now, this is one of the earliest things found in the village. It dates well over 10,000 years ago. And this was found in one of the digs up at Blazing House. So, right back to the Old Stone Age. From that, people gradually became farmers. And they all obviously had various religious beliefs. We've found no ancient temples, there's no standing stones around here. But a common thing, back before the Romans came, was when they found a spring bubbling out of a bank somewhere, they always regarded that as a sacred site. And sometimes you find deposits of objects put in there. And of course we've got one just here. So this is a view of the church in the 19th century, and you can see the ladies in the front there with buckets of water in their hands. They're filling from the little streamlet that rises, well, it's the other side of the road now, but it probably came out of the bank here in the past. And of course, that sort of thing, even in Arthurian legends, they deposit swords and things like that into the water. So I think this always was regarded as a rather sacred site. Now, with the coming of the Romans, things changed. Now, they didn't mind if you had your own religion. They didn't like the Druids at all. But other religions, as long as you adopted the Roman gods as well, they're quite happy with that, and you can intermingle them. But this is the head of the Roman god Oceanus, and this is found a few miles, well, not even miles, about a mile down the road on the eastern end of the village in the fields out there. We know at obviously up the main road to Silchester, there was possibly a church built there. What happened was that in the reign of this emperor, Constantine, through political bendings and also probably from pressure from his mother, he allowed Christianity to be legal. So that was in 313, and the Edict of Milan is called, and we were allowed to be Christian. And so people probably were already a few Christians in the country. We think by the 2nd century AD there were Christians in England, but there's very little evidence of that. But once this happens, things start altering. And in Silchester, we think there is a church there in the Roman town. The only thing is, churches in those days look rather like Roman temples, so it's a bit of a job to know, but it is quite late, so I imagine they settled themselves down there. Now, things change again. The coming of the Saxons in the 5th century. They came over, they were obviously pagans, and Christianity was pushed to the west, into Ireland and into bits of Wales and areas like that. In 597, the Pope Gregory sent one of his emissaries over, St Cuthbert and St Augustine, came to Canterbury, converted the king down there, King of Kent, and by the middle of the 7th century, right, about 650-ish, the King of Wessex, the man who ruled this area, he was baptised as a Christian. Now, that doesn't say everybody became Christian straight away after that, but that followed the king normally. So I imagine probably with another 50 years after that, there may very well have been a church here in Basing. Now we know on the other side of the river there, on Cowdrey's Down, there were quite a large Saxon settlements, and very large halls. I'm not the biggest one on here, but one of them, when it was being dug before the housing went up in the late 1970s, early 1980s, one of the halls there was the second largest Saxon hall found in England. So almost certainly it was a royal manor. If you had a royal manor there had to be a church or a chapel around somewhere. We still haven't located it where it could have been. But this is possibly what it looked like. Made of split timbers. There are fragments of Saxon churches over in the eastern part of the country. So probably they got, because there's no decent building stone around here, we've got lots of flint, but no large quarries of stone you can rely on. So imagine the early building would have been like this. But things began to alter. In the 9th century, of course, the Danish armies invaded England. And in 871, one of a numerous number of battles fought that year, there was a battle fought here, the Battle of Basing. And I think that was a turning point in English history. The king at the time was Ethelred I, and I think he was wounded here. The Saxons did lose it, but they went on to fight down the road in Wilton as well. But in between that, he made his will stating that his brother should take over rather than his own sons because they were too young. That brother was Alfred, became known as Alfred the Great. So things really changed possibly from the battle that was fought here. And I think the village, because I think the Danes headed for this direction because of the royal connections, they thought it was going to be money here. And I imagine the village was burnt. And the church would have gone up in flames at the same time. Moving on into the 10th century, we get a mention of a monastic building, a monastic house in Basington. It's set in an area of ground called King's Horsecroft, which I think now is where the earliest Norman castle is down the road. Oliver's Battery, as it's aptly named down there. Now, whether it looked like this or much smaller, then it would have been the monks that would have held the services for people locally. And certainly they were also looking after Basingstoke at the same time, which was beginning to grow at that stage. Basing was the bigger village, Basingstoke the small one, but Basingstoke began to get bigger and bigger. (1066). William the Conqueror lands in this country, and things alter again. And he gives the manor, which had been a royal manor here, to one of his supporters, Hugh de Port, who had fought for him at Hastings. And de Port, of course, builds that castle down the road there, an earth and timber castle, a modern Bailey castle. And the first mention of a church we get is in 1070. Doesn't say anything about it, but we know there was a church here. But I think it was probably that monastic house still. When the Domesday Book is produced, the church is not mentioned in Basing. And I think what it is because it's inside the castle. The castle's enclosed it down there, and any castles don't appear in the Domesday Book. They're looking for the land to tax and what have you. So I think it is inside that, hence no mention. And the manor, the parish itself, is given the announcement, as it's called, the people who decide who's going to be the vicar there, that's given to Mont Michel in Normandy. So it's a long distance to send messages backwards and forwards. So there's Oliver's Battery, as it's called, and I think the church, if it was there at all, never done any excavations, and they did some electronic work, but of course if it was a timber building it probably wouldn't show up. So that hub in the front is the Mont, and the church would have been further over in that direction. And that's not unknown for Normans to include the church into their castle. Moving on into the next century, this is King Stephen, and we had a lot of problems. We had civil war raging through this country, and a lot of it took place in this area. So how that affected what was going on here, we don't know. But towards the end of his reign, the de Ports moved their castle. They moved up to what was now Basing House. And I think that's when the church moved. and began to be situated here, where the first church may have been. I mean, there's no evidence for that, but I think that's when they moved here. There's the modern the ringwork and basic reconstruction, obviously. And I think for the first time the church was built in flint. This is just my sort of sketch, which it may have looked like. With the tower, basically where it is now, an aisle, sorry, the nave, no passageways either side, and this end, where we've got this elongated part of the church, so the chancel, was much shorter. We think it was an absidal end, so you've got this circular bit on the end here. And one of the reasons for looking at it like that is because down here, and it still survives, just around the corner there's blocked out, there's a little squint that people on the outside can look through and see Holy Communion being carried out. And it places it far much further forward than the present altar there. And around about the time, of course, the tower was built. And the only surviving bits, if I put it on the slide here, these here. This is the organ side, the north side, and these are actual parts of the Norman church. Same on this side over here. And part of that tower still survives. And the little bit with the squinting is a little bit which jutted out in that direction there. And each capital is slightly different. If you get going later on, have a look, they're all slightly different carved. But I think still the main part of the church would have been flint built, with the cornices of imported stone. And there's quite a bit of carved stone that came all the way from Normandy, and stuff from the Isle of Wight as well, to make the cornices and things like that. Moving on now into the 13th century, this is King John. I like this picture because his crown's fallen off. Things began to go quite badly wrong in this country at the time, and there was no real Robin Hood to clear it up either. And at this time, King John fell out with the Pope, because a new Archbishop of Canterbury had been elected by the monks at Canterbury, and John would not accept this. So the proposed Archbishop of Canterbury had to flee overseas. And to punish John for this, and the country basically, Pope Innocent III put a papal interdict on the country. That meant nobody could go to church services. The bells couldn't be sounded, that's why the bell shown there without its clapper inside. So this is 1208 when this happened. And the only church service, well, not even so, but the only thing they could do was to baptise babies. You couldn't be married in a church, and you couldn't have your funeral in a church. And you couldn't be buried in the burial grounds around the churches. So this was very awkward for little people. So that's why we've got Holy Ghost ruins up behind the railway station in Basingstoke. That field it was built on was chosen to bury people when they couldn't be buried in the churchyard. It was consecrated after the interdict was lifted. So whether people from here who died are carried through to Basingstoke for burial, I imagine that's the case, because I don't think we've ever found anything outside which would indicate that there was a medieval burial ground outside the church here. Again, around about this time, the church was extended, so the chancel was extended out in that direction. The interdict, by the way, was lifted when the King John gave in to the Pope, because he wanted to go to war with France, so he wanted it sorted out before he went over there. And of course, it was a catastrophic war, and that's when we lost Normandy. So all that was going on in the background, and of course people were being taxed and what have you. And of course Magna Carta crops up shortly after this. And King John went to Magna Carta from the Odeon Castle, went to Runnymede. And there are bits surviving from the period it's around the corner there, the medieval acoustic tiles. And they have found a few bronze standing as well, I believe, which showed a scene from the Crusades, but there were only bits of them. So the floor was certainly highly decorative. What you've got to remember is the inside of the church would be highly painted as well. There would have been a rood screen. See this further arch here, there would have been a rood screen there with a cross on top of it, the rood on top of it there. And then only the clergy would be that side, everybody else would be this side. And there would be no pews in the church. You stood up for your services. That's why, you know, when they say you go to the wall, that's what old folk used to do. They had to go to and lean against the wall during services. But they're rather nice, those. Now, the vicar at the time, for a long, long time, was, put his name right now, Philip de Lucy. And he was not just vicar of Basing and Basingstoke, but he was also vicar of Paddington down in Surrey, get it right in there, Selborne. Now, how many times he would have been here, we don't know. So he would have had a couple of curates working for him to cover both churches and the other places as well. And slightly later on, in the date would be 1233, thereabouts, this man here, Bishop of Winchester, Peter des Roche, actually got to be able to buy the endowment of this church from Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy. And he gave it then to Selborne Priory. And so there were never any more vicars here then. They just used to send the monks up occasionally to do services in both in Basing and Basingstoke. And I think they used to get all sorts of pranks. So they didn't stay in office very long. They were always changing them. But the vicars would have been in place a lot longer, but they weren't here. They were elsewhere, usually at Selborne. Go on. Moving into the 14th century now, calamitous century, that climate change began to kick in the beginning of the 14th century. It began to get colder and wetter, and the crops began to fail. We went to war, the 100 Years' War with France started. Two of our reigning monarchs were murdered, Edward II and Richard II. And of course, in the 1340s, the Black Death, the Great Plague, came to England. And within a matter of 4 years, 3 of the vicars all died from plague. So goodness knows how that affected the ordinary folk as well, how many would have died during this. So again, there may very well be somebody a pit for burying quite a large number of people, but we're not looking at a big population, of course. But by this stage, Basingstoke is becoming a more important place. One of the reasons for that is this is still under a manor, but Basingstoke was the property of the king. And he's basically sold it off to the people of Basingstoke as long as they paid him a certain amount of taxes and whatnot. So they were under their own, they could do what they wanted basically. So they had a fair and things like that. Couldn't do that here. So Basingstoke began to rise up and the population got bigger. And eventually the church there became the important one. And this was when they had a vicar there, this is where the curate would come, to this church here. Moving on to the end of the 15th century now, this is when the ownership, the manor has gone through several different families, but in the 15th century, the last of the Poyning family married into the St John family, or the Paulets as it were as well. And this is the coat of arms of John Paulet, and he's the one who inherits Basing House, and he's the one who starts doing work here in the church. Now, by this stage, it's possible that work has been done earlier on, but we've got no records for these things. It's only been looking at bits and pieces of the architecture and what have you around about. We know he began to do building work because look at that, that's the one that's up there above the chapel here. So people weren't sure whether he was the one who built all that section, or whether it was just his little sort of chantry chapel there where he was going to be buried. I'm not quite certain. But things certainly altered in the 15th century here. So the aisles were probably added. The chapel was put on there's the chancel here, and this chapel, this one behind me here, was added for John and for his father to be buried in. So there's the chapel from the outside. And the amazing thing is, so those windows, they're made of wood. I don't know of any others anywhere in the area from the 15th century that are made of wood and still survive. They're made of chestnut. The only thing that is rotted basically are the lower bits here. They've been replaced in some cases, but the rest of it is very early Tudor, or late 18th century possibly. I don't know if you've ever noticed, this is at the eastern end of the church. There's a gargoyle there, it's got a thing sticking out the top of his head. And that's possibly part of a little, like they've got on the church tower now, as pinnacles. So there may have been pinnacles at each corner of the end of the church. And that little bit still survives. Moving on further into the 16th century now, Henry VIII, of course, comes to the throne, staunch Catholic to start with. Because of marital problems, though, he breaks with the Church of Rome and declares himself head of the Church of England. Now, how that went down here, we don't know. And things began to reform. But again, I said, we don't know how far these things were happening. But the owner of the house at the time now is William Paulet. He's here throughout the best part of the 3/4 of the 16th century. William is in charge here almost. And of course, after Henry's died, his son takes over Edward, and he is a very staunch Protestant. And things really begin to get smashed up in churches now. Again, we don't know how much gets damaged here because it's right next to the big house, and they might have said, we leave things alone. But William Paulet, he describes himself as the willow, not of an oak, so he blew with the wind. I think he changed religion, denominations basically, 4 times in his lifetime, and didn't protest about any of them. But anyway, things were getting pretty well knocked around in most places. These are some of the other churches in Hampshire which were damaged at the time. Great stone green screen down there, Hebron Worthy, completely scraped off the wall. That was a great Saxon carving. You can see how the plaster in the other window there, in the church there, it's been plastered over to cover up all the painting on the walls there. And Bishop Hall, who comes a bit later on, but he's under Elizabeth I, he was a great one for doing these, the one who had a lot of this smashed up. There's William Paulet, and he became one of the most important men in the land. He never appears in any TV dramas and whatnot, but he was the man there all the time. He ended up as Lord Treasurer of England, and he worked for Henry VIII, Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and he dies in office, almost 90 years of age, in 1571, still the Lord Treasurer of England. And with the money that was coming in, he rebuilt Basing House to become the largest private house in England. In fact, it was bigger than all the royal palaces, with the exception of the Tower of London and Windsor Castle. Anyway, he decides, when he's doing all this building work, he'll probably have a go here as well. And of course, with the changes of religion, that's Mary I of England, who was a staunch Catholic. And there's a new husband, Philip II of Spain, or he wasn't Philip II, he became Philip II of Spain a bit later on. They had their honeymoon in Basinghouse. Whether they came here or not, I don't know. But if she was she really was a staunch Catholic, and with Philip as well, a Catholic. Whether the church had been rather knocked about and they hurriedly had to paint it up again or not, or whether they didn't bring them down here, they stayed, because there was almost certainly a chapel in Basinghouse itself, but we don't know. So all these times things will go backwards and forwards in a very short period of time. So building work going on in Basinghouse, and I think, as I say, really important decides to have a go at the church here. Now, who were building these things? I've got these two little figures here. I think they're based on people who were actually working on the church at the time. So the chap at the top has actually got a hammer in his hand, so I think he's one of the masons. And the chap here doesn't look like the normal gargoyle. He's got a nice big moustache and a little coif over the top of his head, a typical sort of workman of the period. So I think his mates probably carved these and put them in the wall. And of course, William decides that he wants his own chantry chapel as well. So that's when what's now called the Bolton Chapel is built. And this is the inside view. One of the exciting things that we found not that many years ago was when they redid the paintwork there, they found these images scratched on the walls underneath the later statue there. And they're the setting outlines for that window there. So that's when you have a look later on, you can see the scratch marks, and that's how they worked out the design to fit into the west window there. There it is from the outside. And William rebuilt. The lower parts, the flint bits, are what was there before. But he massively rebuilt this house, this church. These columns probably date from his time. The roof is, that survives that is, from later times. And of course the Bolton Chapel, as it's called now, was built, and there's two tombs put on that side. By the way, the doors, they're reused. That's not just the door woodwork bit, but the frames. They've been put in, so that this door is certainly medieval. It's been reinserted into the Tudor walling there, and the drawbar is built into it as well. That door is, I'll talk about that one later on. The door over there is this one here. That's the south door. That's been moved as well into that position, and there would have been a porch at a later stage, but not when it was first inserted there. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. But during the Civil War, the church was fortified. I'm not certain about this, but there's some patches here, oblong patches added to the door, which are possibly musket loops, soldiers to fire through. And they certainly look like musket ball impacts in the wall as well, in the door there itself. This is very large woodwork. And this is where the door you came in today. Again, that's been moved. That's what I was talking about. The drawbar obviously is on the inside. But it's part of an arcade by the look of it, and they just chopped it off. Now, where that was before, whether it was part of this church or they've got it from some other building, we don't know. There's a lot of recycling went on here. And the famous little figure of Virgin Mary holding baby probably dates from, well, it does date from John Paul's initial starts of the rebuild here. But William had it moved up a bit further. That's why it's in the different sorts of brick further up. Here's the tombs themselves. That's the one on the right under the arch there. That's where William Paul is buried, the first Marquis. His son is probably in the second one here, and then that's his father and his grandfather and the two further ones over there. Now these have been badly mangled up in the past during the Civil War, so they're a lot plainer than they would have been at the time. Covered in little engravings. That's the poignant coat of arms there, and that's the key with a knotted cord around it. I see that a lot in some of the little cradles around about here. People used to think that was William Pauler's badge, because he was Lord Treasurer, but it's like dates back early, like to one of his ancestors. And the view there looking through from the chapel itself. And I think there were figures on there, full life figures on each one of the chests. When I was at Basing House, we had a length of carved arm, Tudor decorations, sort of slashed sleeves, just a part painted. And I think it may be from here. Because after the church, and I'll tell you more about this, it was repaired after the Civil War. They built a porch in front of that door there, which was demolished in, I think, 1860-ish, something like that. And they found lots of carved stone, including the Pole coat of arms, which is on display up in the museum there now. And I think some of the other bits came from there as well. So I would be surprised if there were actual figures on those two chests there, which got smashed off during the Civil War. Now, I'm not advertising my wife's novel, it's just this is one of the interesting people who are probably buried in the church. Her name is Joan Lark, and Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, was married to her, despite being a cardinal. It's called a non-canonical marriage. But and a lot of priests were like that at the time. But he, as he got higher and higher up, couldn't do this anymore. So she had to leave him. She married a man called Thomas Lee, I think his name was, up in Cheshire. And after his death, she married George Paulet, who was the brother of the first Marquis. And he eventually owns Cromwell Manor, and there's a little memorial to her on his tomb there, but she's not buried there. She died before we got Cromwell, so she's probably buried in this church here. And those who like watching the television dramas, and the Mirror and the Light was the last one, wasn't it? Also buried here is Gregory Cromwell's wife, former wife. She, of course, was Elizabeth Seymour, sister of the Queen, and she was the third wife of the second Marquis. So she's buried there, and there's a scratch mark, evidently, going down into the tomb vault there, which actually records her name scratched on the wall. And whether her remains are actually still there, I don't know. Lots of coats of arms everywhere, all relating to the ancestors of the Paulets, various families. You see these carved in all sorts of places. There's a whole set of those Gordon Key designs there, the velvet designs. There's the arms, scalp arms, early. And they decorate both the inside and the outside of the church. So that's William's chapel. He built the house, his tomb, so that's the outside of it there, slightly bigger than the aisles. And you can see it's completely brick built. And that would have been covered over then with this white plaster, so it matched the rest of the building to make it all look the same. So it got white in the distance. There's the view from above. And he built the top of the tower again. Bricked up, you see up there. Well, people said it was not done in the Civil War. I don't think there's any, I can't see if that happened, because there weren't enough big guns in the house to knock that down. So it was probably repaired, but it stands there. And part of the old medieval tower was still inside of it. And I remember years and years ago going upstairs, I think it was 94, when they were putting the heating system in here. I found a piece of medieval wall painting up there. Some of the plaster had fallen off, and there's some little fine lines painted up there on the plaster underneath, and which to make it look like fine stonework. So it's painted with little red lines, so it looks like very neat stonework around this old rubbly flint underneath it. So I imagine the rest of the church was pretty highly decorated as well. And of course, on the outside of the chapel there are these two heads. They used to say this was Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, but almost certainly it's the first Marquis of Winchester, William Paulet there, with his wife Alice Capel there. looking out towards their house in Basing. And of course, when William dies, he's buried here. And this is a sketch done at the time showing the great catafalque which was built here to house his coffin during the service. Must have been anybody that was anybody would have attended that service. They would have all been in here. I don't think the Queen came down, but I think all the representatives would have been here. Elizabeth did come to the village several times to stop at Basing House. Her last was at 1601. She came for 2 weeks and brought 1,500 people with her. So imagine what strain that put on the locality. They did buy the produce they were consuming, but you paid the royal rents, which was less than what the normal value was. And this was crippling to the Paulet family as well. In actual fact, not long after her death, they had one visit from James I, it was coronation year, 1603, and they thought, we can't keep doing this, we can't afford it. So they began to knock Basing House down. So a lot of it had gone by 1610. Some of it was still in use, and they moved down to Hackwood, which was the hunting lodge, so that's where the family was based in. Now people say that the graffiti up, you can see behind some of the columns up there, dates from the Civil War. As you can see, the date on that, 1619, Civil War started in 1642. This was quite a normal thing to have graffiti in the church, and it wasn't frowned on, a lot of it. A lot of the churches up in East Anglia have graffiti showing ships on the columns here to say thank you for the safe return of their ship to the seas, things like that. But most of these are just initials with dates on. That one is 1642, but not a lot happened here in 42, it's the next couple of years. And here's one after the Restoration, 1667, so it was quite a normal thing to have these. There's more of them. Sometimes you get a hand as well, sort of scratched out, and sometimes a foot. So they always put the foot against the wall and just drew round it. And moving on now into the middle of the 17th century, the fifth Marquess of Winchester, Sir John Paulet, he got converted to Catholicism at an early age. So doubtful if he came here very often. And Charles I granted him protection as long as he didn't try to convert anybody and he didn't have mass said in public. So he was trying to keep his head down, but of course the Civil War couldn't do that. Basing House is on the main road from London to the West Country, and it was basically a fortress, so he moved into there, and then we had sieges in 1643, 44 and 45. First run to besiege Basing House on a major scale, Sir William Waller brought an army of about 5,000 men. Marquess had about 250 in the house. The weather was appallingly bad. Waller's men had no tents, they were sleeping in the open, so you can imagine them using this church as accommodation. But that was only lasted 2 weeks, and winter set in and he withdrew. And you can see how close the house is to the church. There's the tower there, and the outer part of the Basing House was there. There was a tower just here. So you can see how close things were. That gun there is quite a large one compared to what was actually in the house most of the time. Now, we talk about fortifying this. I don't think this was, as such was the main fortification here. During the second siege of Basing in 1644, the idea was to completely enclose it with trench works and 4 forts. And this is one of the forts. The trench, and when they put the garage up and when the house just opposite the side of the road up here, they found the trench coming through in this direction. And I think it was Church Lane, because it's a sunken way, so you already had a ditch there. I think that's where the parliamentary guns were put there, not in the church, out there in the churchyard firing the Basing House. Now the house was relieved in 1644 by Henry Gage, and the parliamentarians were driven out of here, and there was a fight around here, so you can actually see some of the... Oh, this is the actual siege up here. This is an incredibly unique picture, because people didn't draw pictures of battles much in this country. On the continent, it was the normal thing to do. This is a completely rare picture showing Basing under siege. And the trenches I mentioned there, these are the ones running around here, besieging lines, and these are the ones protecting the house. So the trench went on further, that's the one that came down here into the churchyard. Some damage on the inside, possibly scorch marks up there in the corner, so possibly where they were having a fire, and possibly for melting, because both sides claim they stripped the lead off the roof. The other side did it to make musket balls. And also the tomb seems to have been broken open and the lead coffins used. Because when the first Marquess's tomb was opened, all they said was a bit of rubbish in there and a couple of bones, so the coffin was gone, which would have been in there. Batteries going on. Damage on the outside, you see the smaller ones, the musket ball hits. Quite a small round shot hit above that as well. So there's quite a few on that side, not much on this side, so it is all fire coming in from this direction. Eventually that fails, that siege. The following autumn really, Oliver Cromwell was sent down here with an army of about 6,000 or 7,000 men. They offered surrender to Basing House, which was turned down. So they storm it on the morning of October 14, 1645, and the house goes up in flames. And then within a couple of days, Parliament passes the ordinance basically saying whatever a man can carry away in the way of timber, lead, stone or brick from Basing House, they can have for their pains. And of course a lot of the village had been burnt down by the Marquess to give him the field of fire for his guns at Basing. So there wasn't much love lost. So imagine a lot of the cottages, certainly then some of the barns along here are built with brick. And whether any of it was moved here initially, we don't know. There's a bit of a gap then until the restoration before we know what was going on here. But we know that the church was in quite a bad way. So there's the storming of Basing House. Church is over there on the right-hand side. There it is as a ruin in 1651, so obviously they still haven't taken much of it away at that stage. Then in 1660, Charles II is brought back to England, and the following year he was crowned Charles II of England. And that's when the restoration work began. And as a plea goes out across the country for raising funds to repair this church. And over there, well, you can see it on the slide here. If I can get it to come up. There's the Royal Coat of Arms, one that's just around the corner, and that would have been here or above there initially. So that's dated at 1660, but I don't think it's that early. I think it's probably because the King England hadn't been crowned at that stage. The door was repaired there, the one that's on the outside there. There's a complete sort of Renaissance style doorway. I don't think it's come from Basing House, it's come from somewhere. But Basing had been in basically a ruin for 40 or 50 years before this was inserted in here, so I don't think that style of door, so it's come from somewhere else. Hence the sort of being bricked in, it doesn't match with the surviving thing. And there's a great big patch of brickwork there underneath that window over there, which you can't see on the inside, which is possibly a breach made in the walls there so they could get rubbish out and brickwork and stuff in to repair the house, and then it was bricked up again afterwards. The church round. Moving on now, Charles Paul takes over from his father, who dies in Englefield, and a bit of an oddity is the sixth Marquess, who becomes the Duke of Bolton. He lives in reverse. He goes hunting at night, has his meals by candlelight, sleeps during the day. And everybody thinks he's as mad as a hatter. But in the meantime, he doesn't like James II. In the meantime, he sends his son over to William of Orange on the continent saying, I'm with you. So when William lands in 1688, the glorious revolution, as it's called, takes place, he appears not so mad in the end. He is rather peculiar. But he's still having to look after that chapel when he paid for repairs to be done to the chapel there. So there's Hackwood House, as it was, where he lived. and that's from his tomb. Now, if you look on the internet, look his name up, it shows, it says he's buried up in Wensleydale. But according to the family, when they opened the vault at the turn of the last century, that came off his lead coffin. So it appears to be there, because that's his Order of Garter, just a tin version of it, but that was found on his coffin down there. Other famous figures, the Duke of Monmouth, who claimed to be the legitimate son of Charles II. He obviously led the Monmouth Rebellion and was executed out of that. But his daughter married into the family, and she is buried in there. And so is her brother, who served in the army later. And so technically they could be the actual people who should have been King or Queen of England at the time. This is the third Duke. Again, a rather odd character. He fell in love with the actress there. That's Polly Peachum, appearing in the Beggar's Opera. This is Hogarth's painting of it, the Opera Pink. And if you look over there, there's the Duke ogling young Lavinia Fenton, which is her real name. And he was already married. But he ran off with her to the continent until his wife was dead, and then he returned. There's Polly Peachum, or Lavinia Fenton. And of course they lived at Hackwood House. And she's probably buried, well, she's buried here, along with her husband. And this is the last Duke. This is the sixth Duke of Bolton, George, whose monument you'll see on the wall in there. He served in the Navy, but he wasn't particularly good. This is a cartoon showing him taking smelling salts because he's been told that the ship is going to go into action. And he had this habit of, if anything went wrong, of blaming somebody else. He was called sternpost forward because one of the ways of getting out of one of the actions, he got his carpenter to say that the sternpost is where the steering paddle is. That had cracked, so they couldn't sail properly, so they got out of the battle that way. They couldn't get rid of him because he was a duke. So he was kicked upstairs and basically became landlocked, and he served in the Admiralty in London, so that's where he ended up. He dies in 1794. He's the last of the line, and it goes down to his late brother's illegitimate daughter, who marries a local gentleman, Thomas Ord, and they take the name of Ord Paula, so they're the ones who take over in the area here. There's his monument up there. It says what a sweet man underneath. You should read the lines underneath that. His wife would so say about that, but he probably had a different reputation in the Navy. So, not long after his death, things began to really alter here. Basingstoke Canal was began to be under construction, so it's in the mid-1790s. Basingstoke by this stage is a much bigger place. About 2,500 population here, just a couple of hundred in this village here. But they do eventually get this being its own church again rather than coming under Basingstoke. I think one more. Sorry, I found this. That's that picture I showed you earlier. So this is what it would look like at the beginning of the 19th century. So we've done 1,000 years now, and what we're going to do is have a break now, slightly later than I thought, and we'll come back, and if there are any questions that I might be able to answer, I'll try. And there's the church today, as she is today. Thank you very much, Alan. That was fantastic.